The job seemed like a miracle. Not too long ago, I moved from Ohio to North Carolina. I had been working as a zoologist and had been making good money, but this new job blew it up. After making the trip to North Carolina, I quickly got started. I just had that passion for my job you don't usually see anymore. But this job was the one I had been waiting for. I got to go in the ocean and study the complex, majestic ecosystem. I couldn't wait. The night before, I thought of all the things that could go right. Turns out I should have been looking for the things that could go wrong. As we first got out to the ocean, there wasn't much to see. We saw some interesting things, but I knew we hadn't seen anything yet. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I got into my bunk and fell asleep. 3 hours later, I was awoken by the sound of water churning near our boat. I groggily removed myself from bed and staggered over to the railing of the boat, and not too far away I saw something moving just beneath the waves. At first I thought it was a whale, and then I heard it. Some sort of low yet loud humming. Puzzled, I continued to observe the massive shape, and after a minute or so, it flicked its tail above the surface. Something about it felt odd, but I just couldn't place my finger on it. Frustrated and tired, I returned to my bunk and laid down. Unfortunately, I didn't catch much sleep that night. I wasn't scared, but puzzled more than anything. Nonetheless, I eventually fell asleep a couple hours later, but it wasn't for long. I was suddenly awakened by a mass panic on board. I whipped out of my bed and walked outside. I asked one of my colleagues, Scott, what was going on, and I was shocked at what he told me. One of our marine biologists, Noah, was missing, just gone from the boat, and the panic ensued. It went on like this for 4, maybe 5 hours? By the time we had calmed down, it was 3. As sad as we were about Noah, there was nothing we could do. We had no idea where he was. We assumed he had fallen overboard, but after circulating the area for hours, there was nothing in sight. So, we continued on. But we should have stopped right there. If we had, we might have just saved ourselves. So we continued to work, but nothing really felt the same. We were all quiet and emotionless, and as the end of the day neared, I was given some news. I would be sent down in a pod. I was the one going deep underwater. Why me, I thought. Why was I the one to go down into the depths? After what had happened, I was just very nervous and afraid that even the slightest thing could go wrong and end with me trapped down there or drowning or something. That night, I had just considered not going down, refusing to do it. But that's when the thought came to me. That's how I would get all of this off my mind. By going down into the depths, into a place that I loved studying so much. The next day, I was excited and I was ready. I ate my breakfast and prepared for the mission. I would leave at 1 p.m., and I would have enough oxygen to last me until 11. I waited eagerly to dive down, and when I saw the pod, I ran over and was ready to enter it. I'm still kicking myself for that one. Being giddy, like a schoolgirl. Why did I keep going? Why did I get into that pod? But before I knew it, I was in the depths. As I was descending, I stared out the pod windows. This was all so mesmerizing for me. I had studied it from afar, of course, and knew so much about where I was. But seeing it in person, being immersed in it, is indescribable. The sea was full of life, and I was down here, experiencing it all in person. Eventually, I settled in and simply enjoyed the show. It wasn't long after that when things got weird. Suddenly, and at once, the sea life seemed to completely disappear. At first I was confused, but then excited. It had to be a shark, I thought. But after 10 minutes of eagerly looking around, there was nothing. You can imagine how disappointed I was. I sank down deeper, and was happy that there was life once again. I wasn't too deep in the scope of the ocean, but for humans, well, let's just say that's a different story. At this point, I just continued to observe whatever I could. This was all so new and exciting to me. But then it happened again. Everything just disappeared. Afraid of being disappointed once again, I looked above me. I don't know if I should be thankful or if I should regret that decision. What I saw was not a shark, but a serpent-like creature, probably 80 feet in length. I would have thought sea serpent if it weren't for the fact it was some sort of giant eel. I went black for a few moments. When I regained my composure, I jumped. I could still see the giant eel. However, it seemed to be eating something. A closer examination showed it to be eating a great white shark. How ironic, I thought. The great predator of the ocean as man knows it, devoured by something much, much larger. I was both terrified and mesmerized. As I examined this new ocean predator, it hit me. The tail. That was the tail. And that's what I had felt was off. The tail. Back on the boat, I thought it was a whale, but now thinking back, I knew it was the tail of an eel. How did I not notice it? But as I thought about it, my mind drifted to something else. Noah. I mean, I saw this the night he disappeared. Did this eel kill him? This thing. It is a sea monster in every sense of the word. At this point, down here in the depths, I just feel hopeless. I am in the presence of an 80-foot-long sea monster that quite possibly killed my colleague, and my body is conflicted. The zoologist in me is excited that I just discovered a new creature, and a particularly large one at that. If there are monsters down here, could this open up the possibility of more cryptids being real? As excited as I was, the other me was scared. The other me wanted to just leave and never come back. Eventually I decided I would leave, but I needed proof. My pod has a syringe, so I can take blood samples. Plus I can grab things with the claw. As I pull out the syringe and prepare to do it, I realize that this job requires me getting close to the creature. And I'm having another internal debate. But I don't have time. The eel is about to finish its meal and leave. So I took a deep breath, and as I approached to get the blood sample, the eel bolted away. The whiplash of its tail knocks my pod back, and I smack my head against the window. I touched my head and wiped the blood on my forearm. What happened? Why did it leave? Did I scare it? Could it be scared of me? Of course, after eventually looking out to where it was, I realized it had just finished its meal. As I approached the shark's corpse, I was immediately filled with excitement. One of the eel's teeth was still stuck in the shark. I immediately pulled it out and began rising to the surface. As I neared the surface, I just couldn't get my mind off of where exactly the eel went. How long had that thing lived out here? How many were there? How in all of modern history with the technology that we have, had we not detected it or scanned it or have any records of it besides tall tales? Was that even the largest creature that lived in the ocean? As I breached the surface, I loaded into the boat and got out of my pod. I reiterated everything I had seen to everyone on board, Unfortunately, it seems the eel's tail had destroyed the cameras, and it seems some sort of electrical current had gone through the pod and damaged some of its electronics. But luckily, I had proof. I pulled out the tooth, and everyone was just stunned. It felt great, making a major scientific breakthrough like this, but it didn't last long. Something rammed into our boat. Not something. I immediately knew it was the eel. Terrified and panicked, people began to run in all different directions. Some ran for their bunks, others stayed outside. Our captain was moving the boat as fast as he could, but the eel still caught up. This time, when it rammed into the boat, it broke something. The captain had a look of horror on his face. And then it stopped. The ocean fell silent, and the boat stopped rocking. And then all at once, the creature began thrashing. And that thrashing, if continued at that rate, would destroy our boat. There were 1,000 thoughts going through my head, and I didn't know what to do. And that's when it hit me. It wasn't the first time that something had hit me in the figurative way today, but this time it was different. This time, the idea hit me like a truck. Why would this creature, the alpha predator of the ocean, even be hunting at the surface? This creature, as large as it is, should be living down deeper in the water, hunting bigger things. Unless, of course, it was forced to the surface. And then I began to build on that theory. Was this eel not the top of the food chain? Maybe that's why it left in such a hurry earlier. Why it's been at the surface. And at that precise moment, I felt helpless. This 80-foot-long eel, something much, much larger than anything we've known, could be dwarfed by something much larger. I was pulled out of my trance by humming, but it wasn't coming from the eel. So what was it? Suddenly, blood began to color the water. The eel was violently pulled away from our boat by something unseen, something much larger. It began to pull the helpless eel down to the depths below. And just as suddenly as it started, all fell silent. I was both terrified and mystified, but most of all, I just wanted to leave the water. Unfortunately, our boat was disabled, and we had to call for rescue. Eventually, the Coast Guard picked us up, and I still don't know what to think. All I know is that there was some titan that lurks in the deep, and it's capable of killing sea monsters. So what does that make it? I don't know what it is, but all I know is that we need to stay out of the water. And please never visit the open ocean. You never know what monsters you may encounter. Old legends speak of sea monsters, such as the kraken and the sea serpent. I never thought there was any truth to those legends. But of course I know better now. I know that those are more than just tales from paranoid sailors. I've seen proof of these legends myself. And now, the government knows. And the public. Yes, even the public now knows about the eels. But they don't know about the thing that ate the eel. And as frightened as I was, I had to know the truth. I wanted to find out what else was out there. It wasn't the money, though I was getting a rather large paycheck. It wasn't necessarily wanting to study the eels, or how they lived. It was plain old human curiosity. And you know what they say about that. No matter what convinced me to get in that pod and travel to the depths of the Atlantic Ocean again, I did it. And I wasn't alone this time. We all had specific pods, with 2 pilots in each. I don't feel like boring you by telling you all their names. It's hardly important anyway. Just know that there were 5 pods, and each pod also had its own designated code name. There was the Orca, the Barracuda, the Hurricane, the Riptide, and then our pod, the Typhoon. We were briefed on our mission, and I felt like some sort of soldier. Originally, I thought we were being sent down just to study the eels again and find out what was hunting them down. However, we were told that they have reason to believe that there are monsters down in the murky depths, and not just that one, but more species of monsters in the ocean. And this was a whole new development for me. After the briefing, they sent us to our bunks. We were meant to wake up at 5 a.m. and begin descent at 8. Although no monsters disturbed us this night, I was still on edge. After we were woken up, we were treated to a surprisingly good breakfast. Sausage, waffles, and eggs, and a thought I didn't like crossed my mind. What if everything was so quality because they thought it might be our last meal? I just crossed it out as being overly paranoid. Slowly, we prepared up for our descent, and then when the time came, we filed one by one into our pods. We were lowered into the water, and like that, we were sinking into the depths. I tried to stay calm, but sweat rolled down my forehead. My partner James seemed to notice. However, I could tell that he understood my fear. I just tried to shrug it off as we continued forward on our descent. After a few hours, we reached the bottom. I was treated to a sight I did not expect. There were octopus and crabs on the seafloor, a lot of them. And though that wasn't necessarily shocking, the thing was how giant they were. 20 to 30 feet in length. One of the pilots of the Hurricane, Brad, spoke over the radio.
"Does anybody see that?" "Yeah. How can you miss the giant crabs?"
I said.
"No. Look up."
As my gaze shifted upwards, swimming above us was an eel. But it wasn't 80 feet. It was at least twice that in length, and it had something in its mouth. As it slithered through the ocean, we were able to get a better look at its mouth, and in it was a smaller eel, and that one was still 20 feet in length at least. I was shocked. These eels were cannibalistic, and that made sense now. That's what had to have eaten the 80-foot eel, just a much larger eel. The things likely migrated up to the surface of the water to stay away from the larger ones. It was an acceptable answer, but something about that answer didn't feel right. Eventually, we decided to split up. The best way to make new discoveries was to divide and conquer. James and I saw many of these supersized creatures, but nothing else really surprising. Perhaps the most interesting was the 2 enlarged goblin sharks that we saw. One was 34 in length, while another roughly 45 feet. Other than that, there wasn't much else. We were both excited and then eventually bored. As we trekked further, we received a distress signal from the orca. Nervous, we went to their location as fast as we could. Their pod wasn't moving, so that was either good or bad. But as we got closer, we quickly realized that it was definitely bad. Right in front of us was the pod, cracked open like a shell, and we knew what that meant. The water pressure must have crushed them. At least it was quick and painless. We tried to radio back up to the boat, but our radios refused to work. This was starting to look like a disaster. I told Brad that we needed to leave, but he didn't listen. We tried to continue communicating him through our comms, but he just wouldn't let up. Throughout the bickering, we began to see a giant crab that was much larger than the other ones, and it seemed to be floating. But as I turned my attention away from the conversation, I realized that it wasn't floating, but instead was being held up by some giant squid. And then, something else approached. Something massive. And it couldn't be what I thought it was, but it was. It was a Mosasaurus, a creature thought to be extinct, just thriving down here. It seemed to have armor, which was likely an evolutionary tool, and it approached the crab and began to tear it limb from limb. The squid tried to pull the crab into its cavern on the side of the trench, but the Mosasaur latched on and wouldn't stop pulling. The Mosasaur tore off another limb, and as a result, it nearly lost the battle for the crustacean. Then the squid pulled the crab closer to its cavern. The squid was smart. It was trying to lure the Mosasaur towards its cavern so it can pull it in with its tentacle. And it took the bait. Just then, the squid emerged from its cavern. And it was actually more monstrous than we imagined. It grabbed the Mosasaur, its sheer strength snapping the reptile's neck. We all just sat there in stunned silence. Suddenly it turned its attention to us. It grabbed the hurricane and pulled it closer to investigate. And it didn't even try to eat the pod, it just observed. However, the strength of the creature, which was for sure the kraken in the flesh, broke the pod without much effort. The rest of us in the remaining pods fled. And we were out in a hurry, but once again, we disturbed a large creature. And it was at least 100 feet in length. It had long crocodile-like jaws. It grabbed the riptide and cracked the hull. James pushed the control and we tried to leave as fast as we could. We saw the barracuda escape, but we weren't so lucky. The creature's flipper knocked our pod, which led to our pod getting trapped against some rocks, and me getting knocked unconscious. After about 20 minutes, I awoke to James freaking out. And I could understand why. We were trapped in the dark, with no communication and no method of escape. As I continued to come to, James never even looked at me. So I followed his gaze, and the seafloor had now come alive with giant creatures. And as I looked, I saw something that gave me chills. A creature likely 200 feet in length, holding that fully grown giant eel in its mouth. And then, a loud humming erupted. We were trapped. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. It was torture, just waiting for death, watching the glowing skin of one giant creature after another go by, wondering which of them will be the ones to swallow us whole. But it didn't happen. James and I just sat there in silence. I could tell that James has accepted death, but I haven't yet. We should have oxygen for another 7 hours, and that should be enough time for us or the rest of the crew up on the surface to figure something out. For the 2 hours that we had been down here, this hidden ecosystem of giant creatures has come to life. Any biologist would be stunned to see all these giant creatures down here, but me and James weren't thinking about it anymore. One thing we couldn't ignore, though, were the sounds. Sounds unlike anything I've ever heard, and I can't even begin to describe them. But there was one that dominated the rest. That humming. It eventually became clear which creature was the source of the humming as it passed by us. No surprise, it was the one that had killed the giant eel only a few hours earlier. And it was huge. Almost 250 feet long with a body that resembled a whale, but it had the jaws of a shark. The rest of it's too hard to describe, but it definitely seems to be the alpha here, as all other creatures keep a healthy distance, and it had a monstrous appetite. I've seen it eat 4 monsters down here so far. Is that the destiny that awaits James and I? I was pulled out of my thoughts by a quicker humming. And the humming monster was being pursued by, surprise, surprise, something much larger. This new monster was likely 500 feet in length. How long could this cycle go on? James seemed to be awakened from his trance now. His eyes were wide and panicked. He tried to move the pod, but it still wouldn't budge. The pursuit was bringing the creatures closer and closer to our alcove, and we had to think of something. I asked James if we had secondary power, and James's eyes lit up at that question. We began frantically looking for the secondary power switch. I found it towards the back of the pod and flicked it on. I knew it would take at least a few minutes, so I turned back. The humming monster was now being torn apart. Blood seeped into the water as the new monster continued devouring the creature. I was waiting, and waiting, and waiting for the power to kick on. James was stuck in some sort of trance again, watching the creature be eaten. It was mesmerizing to watch. And suddenly I was aware of the power kicking on. The lights were low, but there. However, it seemed to be enough to attract the large creature, and it was already done with that meal, and was now focused on us. It began to approach our pod. Me and James were both terrified. Of course, we thought that hopefully this creature was more interested in investigating rather than eating us. James seemed to finally notice that the power was back on as well, and he came back to life and acted quickly, grabbing the accelerator. The pod roared to life, and we zoomed right over the head of the beast and continued blasting forward. The creature was now in hot pursuit, and it seemed to be almost playfully chasing us, but it was still terrifying. We pushed our pod as fast as it could go with the low power, and we were rising at a decently good speed. Even so, the Leviathan below us was gaining on us. I prayed that this creature would not go further past than the depths. Above us, I could start to see the water color changing. It was becoming brighter, and the creature was beginning to slow down, probably recognizing that it was going higher than where it normally lived. I knew we could do it. James pushed harder than he had before, and suddenly the Titan stopped. I screamed in joy. We made it. We continued to shoot up, and our radio was finally working now, so we were able to call the Coast Guard and the rest of our team. James and I couldn't believe it. We had seen quite possibly the largest collection of creatures and the largest singular creature on Earth, and lived to tell the tale. Though, James and I weren't quickly in the talking mood. As we returned home, something was brought to my attention. A family called me, and they had the diary of a family member from the 1700s. Apparently, it chronicled his encounters with monsters such as the ones we found. I met up with this family to review this journal. I was intrigued, curious, and when I got my hands on it, astounded, to say the least. They were gracious enough to let me take the diary home and read it. And here are some of the key entries.
A sea of humming can be heard all around the boat. The crew and I believe these are the vocalizations of some monster. We were all on edge. By the sounds of it, this creature could be able to swallow our boat whole. Sometimes we can catch a glimpse of a large, dark shape beneath the water, and the humming seems to follow this shape beneath the waves. We found the remains of a ship today. It was washed up on the shores of an island, destroyed by the monster. This creature's power scares me. We are now trapped on the island, and we were attacked by what I can only assume was the fabled Kraken. Many men were dragged into the depths, but soon it stopped and swam out to sea before being attacked by the thing that hums. The two leviathans were locked in a battle. That's when I had begun to turn the boat towards this island. Luckily, the island has good food. I hope that a boat comes and sees us here. I don't want to stay much longer. A boat has arrived. We are finally heading home. The monster has left us, and no one will believe our tale.
I thought back to the old legends of sea monsters. They were all true. I knew that now. And now everybody knows that. There are beasts down there. And the thought of that entrances me. There was one more thing. At the back of the diary was some sort of map. As I inspected it, right at the edge, it said,
"Here there be dragons."
I couldn't help but flash a smile.